at the end of the 16th century, there were 9 basic tastes. In addition to the basic 4, there was sharp, there was pungent. Now this was what the pungent was. It certainly wasn't chili, because they weren't using chili then. Harsh, fatty, and insipid. Now, it's a bit hard to sort of imagine, I mean, certainly you can imagine things that are insipid, but I mean, how can you put that as a basic taste? It's a little bit difficult. However, they were working on it. In the following century, there was a different set of, there was again 9 basic tastes, but they were slightly different, and these are the ones that were reported in the French encyclopédie in the middle of the 18th century. Again, sweet, sour, salty, bitter, and in addition to that, alkaline, winey, which I said was the taste that we found in beer and wine, obviously. Aromatic, well, not quite sure whether that's a taste. Acrid, which was a bit like aromatic, but it was more unpleasant. And then there was austere, which was also similar to acrid, but it was really the one that grabbed you at the back of the throat. Now, whether you want to call that a basic taste, I don't know, but that was what they were thinking of when they were talking about taste, and at least they were discussing taste. And then, half a century later, we seem to have got back to the idea of the basic 4 tastes. Now, by this time, there had been quite a lot of progress in medicine, there had been quite a lot of progress in chemistry, and Savoury, when he wrote his Physiology of Taste, which was also a bit about taste, but it was about a lot of other things as well. He referred to the difficulty of describing flavour, which he said forced us to talk in general terms, such as sweet, sugary, acid, and bitter. So he was going back to sort of the 4 basic tastes to describe foods. And at the beginning of the 20th century, these 4 tastes, the 4 basic tastes, were firmly inscribed in all sorts of theory about taste. There was a tetrahedron of tastes, which 3-dimensional model, which showed sweet, sour, salty, bitter, and all foods could be put on one of the planes between various points, so you could fit all foods onto this sort of model of taste. This was before they discovered umami. I don't know how they fit that 5th plane in somewhere. But I think this fixation on 4s explains why it has taken so long for umami to be recognised. I mean, discovered in 1908, and really people only started talking about it, I think, in the last 15 years. It's only become a word that's been used in textbooks, in general books, really in the last 15 or 20 years. So that, I think, explains why while we might have enjoyed it, we didn't really know what we were enjoying. We didn't, the word was there, we could have used the word, but the fixation, not necessarily of us, but by the people who wrote the books that we then read and learned from, made it almost impossible for another taste to be accepted. We were so hooked on to this idea of 4. Now, while we were still thinking that we only had 4 basic tastes, we were still enjoying umami flavours in Australia. And the dishes, or the umami that we were enjoying the flavour, particularly came in condiments. And on your tables, you can start eating if you like. On your tables you have some cold roast lamb, and you have 4 condiments. 4 condiments that would have been very common at the turn of the century in Australia, and are still reasonably common. The only one that is not common in Australia today is this one, mushroom ketchup. Recipes for mushroom ketchup in English books go back to the middle of the 18th century. And this particular company started making, and still does make mushroom ketchup, obviously started making it in 1830 as a commercial product. The first recipes were for domestic use. So you've got mushroom ketchup, you've got Worcestershire sauce, you've got tomato sauce, and you've got tomato chutney. Now, you've just heard of that. Tomatoes are high in umami. You've also heard that fish sauce and anchovy sauce are also high in umami. Now, anchovy sauce is one of the ingredients in Worcestershire sauce. So this is how Australians before the turn of the century, in the 19th century, and through much of the 20th century, were experiencing the taste of umami. Now, Australian eating habits in the 19th century and in the first half of the 20th century reflected very much the tastes and the habits of their British forebears, though there were some important differences. There was some use made of indigenous ingredients by the new settlers in Australia, but whenever they did use indigenous ingredients, they tended to cook these in ways that were typical of British recipes, of ways that similar foods would have been cooked in Britain. So that rosellas, for instance, the fruit, not the animal, were made into jam because they were a fruit and that was what you did with fruit. Kangaroo was either roast, because that was what you did with meat, or it was jugged, because that was what you did with hare, and kangaroo was said to be similar to hare. So although this was one difference, there was some use made of indigenous ingredients, but still cooked in ways that were essentially British ways. And in addition, there was more use made in Australia of ingredients which grew, imported ingredients, imported crops or fruits and vegetables, which grew very readily here, and tomatoes was one of those. So Australia was eating a lot more tomatoes and doing more things with tomatoes at the end of the 19th century than were English people. The other difference between Australians and the British was that the Australians ate a lot more meat, a lot more meat. Indeed, at the end of the 19th century, Australia held the record for meat consumption. According to Dr. Philip Muscat, a Sydney doctor, at the end of the 19th century, the average per person consumption in Queensland, end of the 19th century, was 370 pounds, which is a little bit over, this is average, it's a little bit over a pound of meat a day. It's a lot of meat. And also, when Australia, as I said, Australians ate a lot of meat, and their meat was cooked in ways that were typically British. It was roast, or it was boiled, or it was occasionally grilled. It was very simple. The plain and simple was the order of the day. They were the words that characterised Australian cooking, and plain and simple were valued. You didn't want anything that was sort of fancy and French. That would be unpatriotic or something. It was also the medical ideal. Doctors thought that food that was plain and simple was going to be much healthier for you than food that had been sort of messed about with. So that's what we had. We had plain food, simple, plain food with meat 3 times a day. And even if you weren't used to a lot of meat, even if you came from England where meat was still a luxury, meat 3 times a day could become a little bit monotonous. And so how did you make it not monotonous? You added condiments. And the condiments that were used were the Worcestershire sauce, the mushroom ketchup, and a whole range of tomato-based products. Here's Marcus Clarke, part of an essay when he was writing a long essay on how to cook a chop in 1874. And he ends up by saying that you have the chop very simply, you know, plain and simple, with salt, with mustard, no sauce, except you can have a little bit of mushroom ketchup, the mushroom ketchup that was made in the household earlier that year.